Mark chapter 13. Well, we come in this chapter in Mark to perhaps the most difficult chapter in the entire Gospel of Mark. That's because Jesus' words in this chapter are an apocalyptic nature. That is, Jesus talks about things in the future and uses apocalyptic language, that is, symbolic language, to do so. Well, this is what apocalyptic sections in the Bible do. They talk about the future, but in symbolic language. But because of that, these sections are particularly difficult to interpret, and that is the case with Jesus' words. So this chapter starts out with a comment by one of the disciples about the size of the stones in the temple in Jerusalem and the size of the buildings. Now, when we think about the temple in Jerusalem, we probably think of a nice, beautiful building for that day, perhaps like the temples of the ancient Greeks and Romans, of which we have some ruins. But that really does not do justice to the temple complex in Jerusalem as it existed in Jesus' day. About 15 years before Jesus was born, Herod the Great had decided to rebuild the temple. Now, Herod the Great loved building projects, and this was one that he had wanted to do for some time. The temple that stood before Herod rebuilt it was the one that the exiles had built after returning from Babylonia, and it was a poor replica of the grand one that Solomon had originally built, and this one was also 500 years old at that point. So Herod decided it needed a bit of an upgrade, and he did so in grand fashion. Herod doubled the size of the Temple Mount, the platform on which the temple stood. He built porches and great staircases. He constructed colonnades and arches and gigantic columns. There were magnificent doors and entrances with grand stairways, and the complex of buildings was of massive size. And on the top of it all was the temple itself, which was tall and majestic and covered with white marble and gold. And so it was a sight to behold for everyone who came there, and they marveled at it. And for all of Solomon's glory, his temple was nothing like Herod's. And for most people, it was far and away the most beautiful and impressive structure that they had ever seen. So we can understand how one of the disciples might make a comment to Jesus about the magnificence of the buildings and the size of the stones. What stunned the disciples, however, was Jesus' comment in response that it would all be destroyed. And when they got a chance to stop on the Mount of Olives on the way back home that afternoon, they asked Jesus to explain what he meant. And so Jesus then begins a long set of sayings about things that are to come. Now, this is a set of comments by Jesus about which a lot has been written. And what exactly do all of these things that Jesus says mean? Well, there are lots of opinions. Some believe his words were primarily for the generation of first Christians. There was certainly persecution coming for many of them, especially those in leadership. And a great disaster was coming to the nation of Israel with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And many of the things that Jesus warned about would seem to have at least a partial fulfillment in that great event, the destruction of Jerusalem. But most people believe that Jesus' words were not all fulfilled in the life of the early church and in the destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, most people believe that there is still trouble and difficulty and persecution, and perhaps even a time of great tribulation that is yet to come. So one of the questions with sections like this is how specifically should we try to tie these symbols to actual events? Should we look for specific fulfillments or just listen for their general theme and application? And people disagree as to the answer to that. The reality is that we probably will not understand Jesus' words until they come true. The nature and identity of the Messiah was pointed to in the Old Testament, but hidden. So in our time, the nature of the last things also seems to be hidden from us. When these things take place, they will make perfect sense, but probably not until then. So with that general introduction, let's look at the exact contents in Mark chapter 13. Well, the theme of the entire chapter is contained in Jesus' first words in verse 5. He says, "Beware." This entire section is a set of warnings. The first section warns against false messiahs who will come, and wars and rumors of wars. Jesus tells the disciples that they will experience famines and earthquakes in many places, but don't be alarmed. These don't signal the end, but only the beginning of the trouble. Well, one thing that will affect them personally, however, is that they will experience persecution. They will be called before governors and kings to testify, and we see this fulfilled in the book of Acts even. James will be killed by Herod Agrippa and have the chance to appear before him. Paul will appear both before Roman governors and Jewish kings. And so Jesus is warning them that they are going to be persecuted. And in fact, says Jesus, it will get so bad at points that families will be pitted against one another and everyone is going to hate you. But then Jesus gives them a promise. He says, the one who endures to the end will be saved. So next in this chapter, Jesus talks about what he calls the desolating sacrilege. This is sometimes called the abomination of desolation. That sounds bad, doesn't it? Jesus is referring to a phrase used in the prophet Daniel. In 3 places in the book of Daniel, Daniel talks about the abomination of desolation, or in other words, some terrible abomination that will desecrate the temple of God. To read just one of those verses and give you some idea about what that says, Daniel 11, verse 31 says, "Forces will stand on his part, and they will profane the sanctuary, even the fortress, and will take away the continual burnt offerings. Then they will set up the abomination that makes desolate." Well, what in the world does that mean? Well, Jesus says that when people see this abomination set up, they should flee from the city of Jerusalem, for it will signal a time of great suffering. So what is this abomination of desolation? Well, that's the $64,000 question. People have suggested that it was when Greek general Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple in 168 BC, 167 BC, by sacrificing pigs on the altar. This would seem to apply to Daniel's words very appropriately, but not Jesus' words, since it had already happened over 100 years before Jesus said these words. So perhaps Jesus was referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. It would certainly qualify as a time of great suffering. And at the end of that time, the Roman legions tore down the temple and they set up their Roman standards on its site. Or maybe Jesus was referring to the building of the Dome of the Rock, the Islamic mosque that now stands at the site of the temple in Jerusalem. Or maybe there is still something in the future that is what Jesus meant. Well, obviously there's been a lot of speculation about this, but no definitive answer as of yet. Well, then Jesus makes some comments about the signs that will appear in that day. Then he says that the Son of Man will come in the clouds with great glory. He will send out his angels to gather the elect from throughout the earth. And this is a picture of what most commentators believe is the end of history and the final judgment. Well, Jesus then gives a lesson from nature. When a fig tree puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. And when you see these signs taking place, Jesus says, you will know that the time has arrived. Then Jesus says that this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. But what generation did Jesus mean? Well, Jesus may have meant the group of people to whom he was talking. If that is the case, then his words refer to the destruction of Jerusalem primarily. Or he may have meant the generation that sees all these signs taking place. If that's the case, then these things are still to come. Well, perhaps the most useful verse in this chapter is verse 32. It says that no one knows the day or the hour when these things will take place. As much as we might like to speculate about all of this, and people certainly do, well, we just don't know. And for that reason, everyone ought to, in the words of Jesus here, keep alert. Make sure that God does not find you asleep in your duties. Keep awake and keep doing those things God has commanded you to do. You can't control the events of the future, but you can control what you do, so therefore stay alert and continue to do what God wants you to do. Well, we have here a very interesting chapter. It's, I think, not one to get obsessed with, although some people have down through history, but we should not do that. When the time is right, we will understand everything that we need to know. And so read Mark chapter 13, and we will see you in the next video.